Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Matthew Henley from the History Department, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Alden Scholar Series talk by Professor Elizabeth Seale from the Department of Sociology. So a couple little announcements, and then I'd like to introduce Professor Seale, who will then give her talk. Please remember, this is a special collections room. There's many precious things here, so no food and drink is allowed. We have the good fortune of having remote guests tuning in as our virtual audience. So if I could please ask them to be sure all your microphones are off during the live streaming. Please notice that you all have these thank you cards on your seats, which the committee has created, and it's very useful to us if you could fill them out and leave them on the front table there so we can collect some information as we plan future events. Now, the Alden Scholar Series is a lecture series that began in 2012. It was originally a collaborative effort between SUNY Oneonta's History Department and Milne Library. Held here in the beautiful Alden Room, our series celebrates SUNY Oneonta faculty members who have published scholarly books or produced book-length projects within the last 5 years. Each lecture focuses on a specific publication by the faculty member, and after the talk, we'll have a question and answer. One special part of the talk is we have copies of the book for sale. We have many copies of the book for sale, and we thank Darren Lyons and the OAS for making that possible. And I think Professor Seale will be happy to sign some copies if you'd like to purchase one at the end. And we have a reception after the speaker has concluded the question and answer in Milne Library Room 318. So you'll just have to follow one of the librarians who will guide you through the labyrinth behind this room where good conversation and good snacks await. And once we've finished with the Q&As, I'm going to give a short list of thank yous to wrap things up. So to the matter at hand, the lecturer today is Professor Elizabeth Seale, and as you can notice on the screen, her lecture will focus on her excellent new book, Understanding Poverty, A Relational Approach. This book is published by a very prestigious publisher in Britain, Polity Press, which operates out of Cambridge, England, home of Cambridge University. And Professor Elizabeth Seale has been a faculty member in the Department of Sociology since 2010. She's been a full professor since 2022. In addition to publishing her book, Understanding Poverty, she has co-edited the volume Rural Voices, Language, Identity, and Social Change Across Place, published by Lexington Books in 2018. She's also authored and co-authored 17 articles and 3 book chapters. And in her lengthy scholarship, she's written on a range of topics, which include welfare, poverty, gender, sexuality, and the local impact of COVID. Professor Seale has been studying poverty for over 15 years, and in this time she's conducted over 100 interviews with people in poverty and several dozens of interviews with people who have worked in nonprofit and government agencies serving people in poverty. She is also someone who has volunteered with multiple agencies, including homeless shelters, food banks, crisis management centers, both in North Carolina and New York. And I must honestly say, I have read her book and would like to reread it more carefully. And I have to compliment Professor Seale for the depth of her research, the immediacy the qualitative interviews give to her topic, as well as her innovative analysis for looking both at the problematic question of poverty and public approaches towards alleviating poverty in a whole new way. So Professor Seale, we'll look forward to your talk. And once she is finished, we'll have a question and answer session. So thank you.
Thank you so much, for all of you to being here. It's really nice. And I want to thank the committee for all your hard work putting this event together, and especially Matthew Hensley for your continued support over the years and really throughout this project. So let's just get right into it. Oops. I went a little too far. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about kind of what I call the backstory, how I came to write this book, my motivations. I'm going to talk about some main ideas of the book, including what poverty is, what a social relation is, and how poverty is a social relation, and how it is relational, and talk a bit about implications. All right, so the backstory, you know, on one hand, poverty is straightforward. You know, you can't make ends meet. On the other hand, it's complex, you know, when we consider what are the effects of poverty. Why do some people end up in poverty? You know, what do we do about it? And it's been especially complex, at least from my perspective, thinking about the competing or opposing reactions that people have, maybe not so much to the idea of poverty itself, but to the idea of people who live in poverty. And I mean, take a moment to think about kind of your own reactions, especially your kind of gut reactions to, you know, the idea of people in poverty. Maybe somebody you know who is in poverty. You know, I'm not going to ask you to share those, but they're likely to vary quite a bit. Some of you probably even would say, I live in poverty. Some of you probably say, I have lived in poverty, right? But there may be a lot of other mixed feelings, fear, trepidation, concern, embarrassment, pity, right? And, you know, a lot of us do have interpersonal connections. Poverty is not something that's, you know, as distant as I think we often like to think. Whether family members or people we assist, especially in roles like teacher or social worker, right, and so on. For me, you know, growing up, I never technically lived in poverty, but I was exposed to many people in poverty. Many of my family members have, while they would not consider themselves people in poverty, they have struggled with severe financial distress at some point or points in their lives. And you know, I don't think my family is atypical at all. In fact, I think my family is quite typical. You know, social class is very complicated, right, in the United States. So in graduate school, I knew I wanted to study inequality. And I knew I wanted to study something that intersected with race, class, and gender. And poverty seemed to me to intersect a lot of these issues. And I knew something about it, but I also wasn't, you know, I didn't think of myself as being too close to it either. But I felt like, I think I needed to explain something to people, something about poverty. And I wasn't quite sure what initially, but I felt compelled to confront the stigma of poverty, I think in a compassionate but scientific sort of way. And partly I think too, because my own kind of mixed feelings about it. So it did take me a while to realize that what I wanted to study though was not poverty as a social problem. It seemed to me we pretty much know why poverty exists, right? What causes poverty to exist? It's no mystery to sociologists, right? Not enough good paying jobs, high levels of wealth inequality, a desire on the part of people in power over the decades to maintain a group of people willing to work for low pay, from which, you know, many of us also benefit. You know, I just wasn't interested in laying all of that out over and over again. And what I wanted to explore was, who are the people who suffer? what have they done to remain in poverty? Right? What must they sacrifice to escape it? What is it really like to live in poverty? Are these people less deserving than the rest of us? Make no mistake. People who are not in poverty believe, generally speaking, of course, that people in poverty are less deserving, right? There would be no justification for poverty otherwise. And what was kind of perplexing to me, or at least maybe not perplexing so much as concerning, is that some of the people who I encountered who believed this actually did have regular contact with people in poverty. Social workers, police officers, people in human services kinds of positions. So if these folks are wrong, how do we explain that? Right? I like a challenge, and it was a challenge. So to give you a little preview. In my time at, working at different organizations that serve people in poverty, I often heard workers at all levels, and this is government, nonprofit, the whole gamut, workers comment about the problems of the clients that we worked with, and often faulting these individual level kinds of problems. And, people would say things like, I don't understand why so-and-so won't help themselves. Won't do this or that, can't just, and so, I think as this quote kind of indicates, it is this focus on the individual in isolation from context, situation, and history, right, that often leads to misunderstanding. So let's look at a few general points I make in the book about poverty in the US nowadays. And this will eventually lead into my assertion that we should distinguish between different types of poverty. Okay. And I do have figures to back all this up, but I thought, I'd kind of give you, for the sake of time, I've presented the claim as opposed to the different reasons for them. Okay. So fact one. Most people in poverty at a given point in time are not in poverty 3 or 4 years later. Fact two, poverty is not equally debilitating. Some people experience poverty for a length of time, but then go on to do fairly well for themselves. Very few of the non-poor are truly insulated from poverty. Fact four, we have the means to end poverty for 99% of Americans. And these different experiences and permutations of poverty exist because poverty is not a monolithic reality. It's a social relation, right, that's always in the process of being shaped. Okay, so we'll come back to these ideas, but let's talk a bit about social relations. So when I say social relation, I'm talking about 3 different things. Right, how we relate to one another, our interactions and relationships, right? And the ways that, a person, a group, or institution, how these affect each other, right? Or might be dependent on one another, okay? And poverty is a social relation also because it exists only in relation to non-poverty or wealth, okay? And being in poverty or not entails certain expectations and obligations, right? And so that's why I say that it is a social relation. And as this quote illustrates, I'll go ahead and read it just in case some of you can't quite read it. It's coming up quite, kind of light on the screen. So this is out of my book. We tend to assume that the results of conditions of living are the cause of those conditions, and that any group of people are the way they are because that is the way they are. However, the conditions in which we find people at one point in time are not the causes of the conditions in which we find people. And, I think this quote illustrates, that thinking about social relations is more useful than applying general characteristics to a group. Or saying something like, well, people in poverty have a culture of poverty and that's why they cannot escape poverty. And I think when I put it this way, the logical fallacy becomes obvious, right? And I hope, right? So what are these problematic social relations? Let's dig a little bit into that. So what I learned from extensive reading and research is that people in poverty experience relations with others that continuously disadvantage them further. These forms of disadvantage are not just monetary. They include interactions that may pay psychological dividends, right? That may be some of the forms of disadvantage may be costly for the person, for the individual, but gives them some kind of psychological comfort, or even, I think, even better than comfort, dignity, right? Sometimes dignity, maintaining your dignity in an interaction comes at the cost of your, it could be your academics or what have you. So a quick example, a student who pretends that they meant to be late or meant to not, that they're not doing their homework was intentional, as opposed to admitting maybe the more shameful reason for it, right? And acting like you just don't care is a more dignifying response than acting, as though, oh, I don't know the answer to this question. And if you just act like you don't care, you don't feel it's valid. Right? But then how does the teacher come to think about you, right? The teacher assumes you don't care. So something like that, right? Not having money doesn't always translate into not having connections or skills. Okay. When it does, of course, it is more debilitating. And some people are in poverty because they're not integrated in society. Maybe maybe it's healthcare. They don't have healthcare. It may be, folks with disabilities being kind of a prime example of, people who are not in institutions, age 21 to 64. People with a disability, 25% or 25 to 26% of those with a disability live below the poverty line compared to 10% of non-disabled people in that age bracket. And that's for 2018, but that's pretty consistent, up or down a few percentage points, but usually more than double the poverty rate for folks with disabilities. But also, single mothers and immigrants, people living in rural areas with, poor training, few employment prospects, people with severe mental health issues. People in poverty are often excluded from, like, the financial industry, where they rely on predatory payday loans and check cashing places instead of banks and checking accounts. Right, so the lack of integration can take many forms, but basically, because there are so many ways to be vulnerable in American society, there's actually a great deal of diversity among people in poverty. Okay. Consider for instance, that half of all Americans born prior to 2000 have experienced poverty for a full year in their lifetime. Anybody shocked at that? Well, okay, consider that child poverty rates were around 25% during the last decades of the 20th century. That's at any given time. So you can expect that substantially more than 25% of individuals fell into that bracket at some point in time over the course of a childhood. And that's just childhood, right? However, between 3 and 4% of all Americans are chronically poor. And so the chronically poor, few of these actually fit the stereotype of the idle, out of work, inner city resident, living on government assistance, right? Which to the American mind, especially during welfare reform in the 1990s, was Black woman with several children, right? That was the image of this stereotype called the welfare queen, right? And that's just very far from the reality of the situation. Very few people would actually fit that stereotype. And even within, even when we're looking at just the chronically poor, there's a great deal of diversity. They live in large cities, but also suburbs, reservations, mid-sized cities, small towns, rural places. In fact, if we look at this map, we can see that the counties with persistent poverty tend to be in rural places, right? The South. Some of them are counties that overlap with Native American reservations, like here in the Dakotas, along the Mexican border. I'm not sure, I think this is San Joaquin Valley, maybe. I'm not sure what the story is there. But you definitely have a tendency for rural counties to be to have more persistent poverty. And people in poverty, they have disabilities, foster care histories, childhood trauma, a 10th grade education, some other vulnerability, or none of the above, right? They are white, Black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian, biracial. They may be a recent immigrant to the US, though most likely they were born here. They are cisgender, transgender, and gender non-binary. They are straight and LGBTQIA+. There is no one face of poverty, right? There is no typical case. The only thing that a majority of people in poverty have in common, besides financial distress, that you can actually say like significantly more than 50% or 55% would be, not having a college education. And even there, that's like, I want to say 70%, but you still got 30% of people in poverty who don't, who actually do have some college. Okay. So even there, there is no typical case. So I think we need to change kind of how we think about poverty, but also how we measure it and how we address it in policy. And this means recognizing, right, people's vulnerabilities, the social circumstances as well that worsen those vulnerabilities, right? Okay, so here, different types of poverty. So I suggest that we think of poverty as comprising 3 different types. There's some fluidity, of course, between these, and these are, of course, historically and contextually specific, but they give us useful distinctions. So you have the deep and chronically poor. You have the insecure, including those who are actually not in poverty, but are at risk for poverty. And the temporarily poor, like those who have some assets, they may be tangible or intangible, right? That like allow them to weather a bad period, right? So these different types, they also reflect the relativity and relational aspects of poverty in that, it's our relations with others, right, that really determine our ability to live a life we value. So deep poverty tends to reflect extensive social exclusion from, employers, right? All kinds of institutions that so many of us kind of take for granted, right? Whereas group two, right, the insecure are also vulnerable in their relations to employers and institutional gatekeepers and even intimate others potentially. But they're at risk of falling into hardship. And finally, the temporarily poor may continue to hold some advantage in relations with others and with institutions, but they also clearly are not free from some level of vulnerability, right? So we'll come back to these different groups. I want to talk a bit more about the first group because in my work and research, these are the folk I encounter most often and who are the most stigmatized, right? The idea of people in poverty acting in self-defeating and irresponsible ways has a long, long history, and it's been and continues to be very influential in policymaking. But in sociology, we're taught that that's either untrue or irrelevant. So how to reconcile this? It's not that there aren't scholars and people who are able to appreciate that, just because people in poverty do bad things sometimes, that doesn't mean, or if they fail at certain tasks, that doesn't mean they deserve to be in poverty. But I didn't see a guidebook out there for really, kind of how to think about this intellectually that appreciated both the ways that poverty is caused by social, economic, and political factors, but also took seriously the complexity of everyday experiences of people in poverty, right? It's not always pretty. So in the book, I look at two dimensions of life, family and opportunity. Okay, so I'm not gonna go into great depth on this, but with family, what do we know about single mothers and poverty, right? That's what I address. What do we know about teen pregnancy and poverty? And what do we know about child abuse and poverty? I think, I don't want to avoid, rather than kind of avoid the most difficult examples of like troubling behavior among people, I think it's really important to kind of confront and understand it. So for instance, I find that single mothers' dependence, whether it's on a man or the state or an employer, comes at significant cost. There are no easy choices for these women, for single mothers in poverty, when it comes to which social relations to cultivate. Teen pregnancy, recent research suggests that while having a child when you're young is no picnic, it doesn't have to mean poverty. If your family of origin is supportive and well-resourced. For many, it makes more sense to say that poverty leads to teen pregnancy rather than the other way around. In other words, young moms in poverty they're giving up something, but they're not giving up a whole hell of a lot in having their children early. Child abuse and neglect, the research shows that more stress, lack of social support for parents increases the odds of child maltreatment. Okay, that gives you a little snapshot, right, of that chapter from the book. Opportunity. Do people in poverty squander opportunity? And J.D. Vance argued that this is precisely what they do and why they remain in poverty in his highly acclaimed book, Hillbilly Elegy. And in this book, Vance argues that the problem with poor people in Appalachia is that they lack a sense of agency. They've become dependent on social institutions. They accept their helplessness, and when offered a chance at improving their lives, they don't step up. Of course, this ignores the fact that these communities have been, historically starved of resources, thanks to decades of corrupt government. So, that was basically under the influence of absentee landowners. But besides that aside, okay, I still can't really agree with Vance's assessment. I mean, Vance might be a much stronger person than I am, but I'm pretty sure that if I had chronic back pain due to my work taking care of elderly people, I'd probably end up dependent on painkillers. I'm not trying to be, flippant or snarky. I mean, I'm pretty sure that if I grew up going to a poorly resourced school where I was, punished for fighting because I was teased for the clothes I wore, then I'm not going to be on the road to college. That I'm not going to say, oh, maybe I should, stop doing the one thing that makes my peers respect me and gives me a sense of dignity for the chance to go to college. More school? No, thank you, right? Or, I mean, if I were being sexually harassed at work and spending 60% of my wages on childcare, I don't think personally, I'm not going to suck it up for the sake of my resume. My point is, I don't see these people as helpless or dependent or passive or lacking agency. I see them as fighting for their lives, like on an almost daily basis, right? So this gives you a little bit of a sense of what else is in the book besides demographics. But I do want to go back to the demographics and the big picture, because they are important. They do illustrate other realities that Vance and other people like him who make similar arguments, right, I should say, tend to ignore. And, many of the problems of Appalachia, for instance, right, that Vance talks about are actually problems of America and not unique to the poor, right, by any means. Okay. So, when we talk about, for instance, the temporarily poor or the non-poor but insecure, we're talking about lower middle or middle income households, right? That basically do not have assets. They lack wealth. Increasingly more people fall into this category, of which some scholars refer to as, rather than considering them like a type of poor, they call them the fragile middle class, which makes a lot of sense. And this is when a person has no real wealth, right, to depend on should something happen and interrupt, they rely on earnings. But anything that interrupts those earnings could disappear at any time. Right. The fact of the matter is that for most of us, for a lot of people, income is not guaranteed. All it takes is a health crisis, a disability crisis, a change in the economy, many other possibilities. So, so this category, this idea of the fragile middle class is kind of synonymous with the type of poverty I refer to as the insecure. But people in this category may come to share some of the vulnerable social relations of people in poverty, but they may also remain different in some ways, right? Especially from people in deep or chronic poverty, right? From even the middle class, which in the book I think I define that as households that make less than $150,000 in annual income, but I'm already having to kind of like increase that sum. They're not far removed from some of the problems and insecurities that we often assume to be lower class issues, right? The kinds of things like that J.D. Vance talked about. For instance, Although drug overdose is more common among lower socioeconomic statuses, drug dependence is rampant across social classes. We've recently started, as a society, paying more attention to the issues of sexual assault, crime, hunger, poor housing, right? These things on college campuses, right? These things are not specific to the poor by any means. Now, the relations of vulnerability tend to be more consistent and persistent for people in poverty, but a lot of the problems are not in themselves unique, right, to poverty. And the solutions to poverty, I believe, would help us all, although they may require some sacrifice as well. Okay, I mean, that's just part of the reality, I think. And solutions are entirely feasible. Okay, during the pandemic, poverty declined to around 8%, the lowest ever, when we measured it a certain way. When we measured it in a way that includes non-cash assistance like food aid, that considered certain expenses like healthcare expenses, cost of living considerations, right? That's the SPM, the supplemental poverty measure, as distinct from the official poverty measure, which looks at like what we call cash income. It will take into account things like if you receive child support, that's part of your income. But if you pay child support, that's not taken out of your income, right? Whereas with the SPM, that is considered, both sides of that are considered, right? Anyway, so it's a little bit better as a measure of kind of hardship in a sense, but during the pandemic, the federal and some state governments gave people childcare subsidies, cash payments. There was an increase in food aid, extensions on unemployment compensation. There were moratoriums on eviction. Many of the homeless were placed in motel and hotel rooms. So this is not to say that we solved all the problems of poverty. We also faced some increased costs for some goods and services, shortage of labor, right? And a lot of people in poverty, things were not always rosy for them either. They had no choice sometimes but to continue working in the public sector, right? Putting their health at risk, that of their family members, and overcrowding as well in the household. But child poverty decreased to 5%. This is amazing. 5%. Never been that low. And food insecurity also decreased, especially for families with children, right? So the extra services were put to good use. But as of 2022, this is already changing. Poverty actually, as measured by the SPM, increased by 4.6%. This does show an increase fairly, almost about as sharp as a decline back to 12.4%. But this is the child poverty measure. When we look at the general poverty measurement, the SPM, that actually increased by 4.6%. All right, there is a larger reality, I think, to recognize in all of this, and that is that we are all vulnerable, some more than others, but it makes sense to support policy that we can depend on should our own social and personal supports fail. And I think it's time to appreciate with some compassion that some people do not even have those supports, right, on which to rely. Okay, I have here some QR codes for a couple of blog posts for those who would like short readings about my findings with policy implications. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor to participate in the Alden Scholar Series. And I'm keen to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you for your excellent talk, and we'll entertain questions now. We do have a virtual audience, so if there is anyone out there in virtual land that would like to pose a question, please type it into the chat, and I think Sophia will be able to read out the question and direct it to our speaker. So are there any questions or comments here or virtually? We get started.
Hi, Dr. Seale. Thank you for your presentation. In your research and in the narratives and from your interviews, can you discuss a little bit about how people in poverty negotiate their relationships in poverty?
Any specific ones you're interested in?
I'm thinking about how people negotiate ties with other people in order to obtain the goods and services that they need to get by.
Right. Sometimes it's quite complex. There's been research that shows that in some communities, like Stack and her research on a majority Black South Chicago I believe it was Chicago neighborhood. There was some very strict rules about give and take, and about you can't just take. And that people relied on that reciprocity, the sort of rules of reciprocity to get by, right? You watch my kids, I'll do your nails for free or something, But what was interesting about that is it actually worked against those, they were so dependent on that, it kind of, sometimes those ties made it really difficult for people to kind of like get out of the neighborhood and make a life elsewhere, because you're giving up so much to live in to get married or whatever, or to kind of leave that community. So that's kind of one example that comes to mind. I think what's kind of interesting is that some people have suggested, and some researchers, there's been this sort of idea of like, oh, do people in poverty kind of learn to use people? But in college, we teach kids to do that, right? Or we teach students to do that, social networking, right? So it's also kind of interesting that a lot of times when we study something that has to do with poverty, it's like we automatically like apply this negative lens on it, and it's just because we kind of are seeing through this lens of, poverty is bad, therefore this must be negative, right? Is that
Yeah.
more or less, yeah. Okay.
I guess kind of based off the example you gave of the South Chicago neighborhood, did you find anything about how people experiencing poverty might have slightly, not like a better time, but having a community like that works together? Was it a little bit easier than versus a community that wasn't as supportive of each other?
Sometimes I think that kind of thing really varies. I think that you can also be in some people in poverty grew up in a very exploitative, because you're vulnerable, people can exploit you. But there also are lots of cases where people have said, for example, I did see some of that with research on people living in public housing. Right, public housing's got such a bad reputation, but there are some people who talk about and have really fond memories of their time in public housing, for that kind of reason exactly. I mean, it wasn't all roses, it wasn't, always great, and there were definitely problems, but there was also sometimes a little bit of that sense of community, and especially, and this is key, when the public housing is well maintained. Just not always the case, but yeah, so there are some positives. Yeah, back there.
Are there any recognized union groups of people in poverty?
Yes. In my research in North Carolina, there was in some urban areas, especially with certain kinds of religious leadership, people may kind of not only come to kind of like accept this identity as people in poverty, but try to make really positive change, right? So that kind of thing does happen. Definitely there are different historical examples as well. In fact, there's along with, civil rights movement, there's also a less well-known welfare rights movement. And yeah, I mean, it's, it does happen. Sometimes it's around public housing, right? So people may come together in a particular public housing project where they develop a union, kind of like a renters union, right? So yeah, that kind of thing definitely happens. And that's why I say, I mean, it's these stereotypes, these ideas we have about, people in poverty as being passive and helpless. It's not to say that that is never the case, or that you don't have some people who don't develop maybe a really strong sense of, I can make a change in my life if I do something. I mean, agency is just being able to intentionally do something, right? And have an effect actually happen. And some people don't have a lot of practice with that. And those people are more like, poverty does sometimes create the conditions for that to happen, where people may, especially if there's, sexual assault, incest, or abuse, people may not develop a sense of ownership over their lives, right? And so that can happen too. That's why I say there's a lot of diversity. There's not one story, it varies quite a bit.
So within the diversity of poverty, did you find that once you broke up poverty into those more specific boundaries, that there were stronger communalities between people within the very insecure groups?
Yeah. Not so much in terms of the individual characteristics, but in looking at their how they could relate with other people, right? So I think one of the benefits of being temporarily poor is you might still have networks. You probably, you might still have family members who can help you get back on your feet. You oftentimes have something like that. So it tends to be the relations that differ, I find. Whereas people in chronic deep poverty, their networks are much more constrained. A lot of times their interactions with different institutions are much more constrained. There are some demographics involved in terms of certain people who are in certain groups of people who are prone, including age, right, and that kind of thing. That definitely plays a role as well. Yeah, I mentioned disability. There's also, race, immigration or citizenship status. Anything that can be a vulnerability in society where it just is another thing, another challenge. A lot of folks, even, young people who are non-conforming in terms of gender, sexuality. There are people who prey on those young people who are kicked out of their family of origin and end up on the streets, right? And that's not the face of poverty you often think about, but it's definitely there.
Thank you for your talk. I was intrigued by this idea that poverty is a constantly shifting social relation, and wondered if you could talk to what some of the most significant qualitative changes in that social relation have been over the last few decades.
Yeah. It's hard to generalize, but I think that as culture changes, the kinds of lives and the kinds of expectations that we have for things change. You know, people, for instance, you know, having to have a cell phone nowadays is, you know, if you want to get a job, or if you have a child that, you know, has severe asthma or something, and you need to be able, you might have to sacrifice to make sure you have that cell phone, right? So that's sort of something that you know, wasn't a feature of the challenges of the poor, you know, a few decades ago, but is today. Or, you know, I mean, back having a telephone, right? But the cell phone things is becoming also, because you have to do so much on the phone, right? And not having reliable internet, that kind of thing, like, has really become a disadvantage. The pandemic and education and children, you know, yeah, it's there's a lot of examples of that, I guess. That and so when I talk about, I think the one thing about social relations that is kind of a drawback is it is so general. It doesn't tell you exactly what to look at, right? So you say, oh, well, you know, let's look at social relations. Yeah, but which social relations, right? There's so many, and they take so many different forms. But it's a start, I think. It's a start in kind of moving from a more individualist kind of focus. Anything? Yeah.
I know a lot of your maps and everything's about the US. Is there another country that you're thinking that you can think of that's like really leading people out of poverty, or any policies that are doing that are making a huge impact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, Sweden and Norway come to mind, in that, you know, in poverty has been significantly decreased. Single mother poverty almost, you know, is like you know, I won't say it doesn't exist in those countries, but it's akin to married couple poverty because of the different kinds of social supports that they have there. So yeah, I mean, even the United Kingdom with their healthcare, I mean, that has made a big difference for a lot of people in terms of, you know, freeing them from medical debt. The number one reason for personal bankruptcy in the US.
Has the category of the insecure middle class, I suspect, has increased historically, which means that there are more people who are vulnerable to poverty, maybe more moving in and out. Has that created any greater empathy or sympathy among the currently non-poor for the poor?
I think so. You know, I don't know for sure, because it's still, you know, elites who are kind of deciding things. So, and that's kind of what my you know, the first thermometer I look at is policy. But I think so, because I think, you know, I think a lot of people today, young folks in their 20s and 30s are you know, struggling with rent and buying a house. And, you know, they know that it's a different life than what their parents had. And it's a much harder life economically, and getting that stability. And I think a lot of them realize, you know, it's, you know, I thought if I go to college, I'd be fine. And there, you know, and many young people actually, like, literally do not have the capacity to move out of their family of origins home. And so I would think so. And I think too, just in terms of like in terms of students and what students think, it seems to me that there is greater sympathy and kind of a better, quicker. They seem quicker to kind of understand some of the problems with welfare and welfare reform and focusing on fraud and that kind of thing. You know, in terms of like welfare policy. Worrying about fraud versus worrying about children hungry.
Now you see a shift in the myth that the poor don't work, which is kind of a lie, the whole welfare queen idea. But what you just said about young people, I'm just wondering if you see a shift in like, maybe that myth is actually starting to go away.
Yeah.
There's greater recognition that you could be working a full-time job and still fall below the poverty line.
Right,
Or you
right,
live in a place where maybe you make a lot of money, but it doesn't pay the rent. It doesn't
Right.
buy the groceries.
right. Yeah, I mean, I used to do like this quiz at the beginning of, like a poverty class, where it'd be like, okay, well, this percentage of people in poverty work, and, they get that right now. They don't, it no longer trips them up. They're just like, yeah, that's not surprised us that a majority of people in poverty work, I don't remember the exact figure, and it changes, so I don't want to bring one up, but that's, yeah, part of my teaching arsenal. I think that they're over the time that I've been teaching, which is 15 years or so more, they seem to kind of be better prepared to think differently about poverty. Which, I don't know, that's gonna put me out of a job, but it's a good thing. It's definitely a good thing.
Do we have any online questions?
No.
Right, so any other final questions for Professor Seale? I have a quick question. As you said, the persistence of sort of blaming the poor, why is this such a persistent trend in the United States and even, I guess, in the West?
I think
How would you explain it, no matter how much the categories of the poor evolve and the economy evolves, this narrative is so hard to change?
I think it's partly because from the outside, sometimes what people in poverty do to survive doesn't make sense to others. It doesn't look good. It doesn't make sense. It seems like you're for instance, why not, if you get a little windfall, why not put that money into savings, right? You're gonna come up short later on and you can use that. No, you don't put that money, if you're living in poverty, you don't put that money in savings. You actually do something fun with it, because it's the only chance you're gonna have for who knows how long, right? I mean, people in poverty, they never go to the cinema, right? Especially people in chronic deep poverty. They never go to see a movie. They never go on vacation. Never. A lot of them have never been out of the state. So like to expect them to be like superhuman and not party or waste money on occasion or buy lottery tickets, I just think, it's from the outside, it's hard to understand. And the other thing is, I think that it's convenient. It's a convenient belief. But I think maybe some of us don't realize the extent to which people in the middle class are kind of included in that too, in terms of seen as lesser than,
Okay, so any other final questions or comments, thoughts? Okay, well, did you have any last comments yourself?
No. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank support from Milne Library and the Dean of Libraries, Darren Chase. I'd like to thank the Alden Series Committee, which consists of Sophia Dunn, Megan Palmer, Mary Lynn Benson, Danny Norlander, George Kobus, and Matt Hunaves. Thanks to students, faculty, administration for attending. Thank you to Laura Lincoln, who helped arrange the streaming to alumni. Thanks to Raphael Webb and Mark Farrell for making the technology work. And we should give a thanks to the head custodian, Matthew LaPalusa. He ensured the Alden room was nice and clean. He rearranged all the furniture. It took several hours of work to get things as nicely set up as they are. And thanks again to Darren Lyons for arranging for copies of the book for sale. We have lots of copies, very reasonably priced. I'm sure Professor Seale will be happy to sign it. And we have a reception in Mill 318. One of our librarians will lead us to, for anyone who'd like to talk to the author and have a little something to drink and eat. We welcome you to do that. And if there's any professors out there who are interested in applying to the Alden series, if you published a book-length project in the last 5 years, just email me, Matthew Hendley, and I can send you a link to apply to give a future presentation. So thanks very much for coming today.